Very warm welcome, Your Excellencies, ladies, gentlemen, friends, partners, colleagues, everyone. Welcome to the British Library, where I have the great pleasure of being Chief Executive, and welcome to a little bit of London that is forever Jaipur.
There is a sense of intense homecoming as we return, even though virtually, to JLF in London. It's been a huge privilege to partner with the British Library, and this collaboration has been so full of joy and learning.
It's a particular pleasure for me to come back to the British Library, which has been my office in London for many years, and where my books have all been written and researched, and it's very nice to see this end of my life sort of double back on it.
Our amazing writers, today more than any time, because of the way the digital age has taken over, we need you to be able to make sense of the past, divine the future, and perhaps set in context what we're going through at this very point of time.
This is the first time I've been to it in London. I've been to the one in Rajasthan before, and it's fantastic. It's got a different vibe here, but it's equally wonderful here.
JLF brings this amazing festival to London. It's a wonderful get-together of writers and thinkers, and you know, I only go to one festival, literature festival in the world, and it's this one.
The people who've been here, both bookshop customers, the authors and the organisers, have been an absolute delight to work with. I can honestly say as well that this is the best dressed, most elegantly dressed crowd at any literary festival I've ever seen anywhere.
It's maintained the standards which I'm accustomed to in Jaipur itself, and I'm extremely happy to be part of it here.
I love this festival. I think it's a privilege for me.
JLF deserves enormous congratulation for the way that it puts its program together here. I think that all of the events are superbly chaired. I think that the setting here in the British Library is just a fantastic environment.
Welcome to the closing debate of JLF London 2020 at the British Library. What an incredible 2 days with amazing sessions, speakers, discussions, debates, and so much more. We're really grateful to the Aga Khan Foundation, our partners, and our patron, the Murthy Family Foundation. Our magazine partner for this series is the week, Journalism with a Human Touch. We'd love for you to consider donating to help us with JLF at the British Library by clicking on the donation link. Please do. This is the last session, and we're quite away from actually trying to find the resources to break even. Our closing debate today is the age of iconoclasm. Britain is full of statues of men once regarded as imperial heroes, many of whom are responsible for acts of loot and pillage that would now be classified as war crimes. This House believes the time has now come to remove them to a museum of colonialism. Speaking for the motion today, Abir Alat, a writer and journalist. Her award-winning travelogue In Search of Mary was a biography of the year. She co-wrote the bestseller Talking About Jane Austen in Baghdad, which was dramatized by the BBC and is one of the Viragos' 50 Shades of Feminism. Nick Robbins is for the motion, author of The Corporation That Changed the World, How the East India Company Shaped the Modern Multinational. He is the professor in practice for sustainable finance at the London School of Economics. William Dalrymple, speaking for the motion, is the best-selling author of In Xanadu, City of Jinns from the Holy Mountain, Age of Kali, White Mughals, The Last Mughal, 9 Lives, Return of a King, and Kohinoor. His new bestseller is The Anarchy, The Relentless Rise of the East India Company and Forgotten Masters, Indian Paintings for the East India Company. Edward Chancel, speaking against the motion, reads history at Cambridge and Oxford. He is the author of Devil Take the Hindmost, a history of financial speculation, and editor of Capital Returns. Swapan Dasgupta is a member of Parliament in India and a columnist for major Indian newspapers. A journalist for over 30 years, he occupied senior editorial positions at the Times of India, Indian Express, and India Today. He writes regular columns for Times of India, Telegraph, and The Pioneer, and is a commentator on television networks. He is the author of Awakening Bharat Mata, The Political Beliefs of the Indian Right. Zareen Masani is the author of Macaulay's Britain's Liberal Imperialist. He has an Oxford History doctorate and is the author of 3 other historical books, Indira Gandhi, a biography, Indian Tales of the Raj, and India from Raj to Rajiv with Mark Tully. He has also written a widely acclaimed family memoir, And All Is Said, Memoir of a House Divided. He speaks against the motion. The debate will be moderated by Mukulika Banerjee, who was the inaugural director of the LSE South Asia Centre from 2015 to 2020 and is associate professor in social anthropology at the London School of Economics. She studied in Delhi and Oxford universities and taught at Oxford and UCL before joining the London School of Economics. Her books include Why India Votes, The Pathan Unarmed, and The Sari, and edited Muslim portraits. She has just completed a monograph, Cultivating Democracy, Politics and Citizenship in Agrarian India. The debate rules, ladies and gentlemen, is I will poll the audience before and after the debate, immediately after this. Opening statements by each person, by each speaker, will be 3 minutes, followed by Mukulika Banerjee, the moderator, will ask questions of our speakers for approximately 10 minutes, followed by audience questions. So please do remember to write this in the comment section below. This will be followed by closing statements by each of the debaters for 2 minutes each, and we will again poll the audience at the end. Please do remember to ask your questions by typing it into the comment section. Ladies and gentlemen, this House believes the time has now come to remove statues to a museum of colonialism. Those for the motion, please vote yes online by typing it into the comment section or raising your hands if you're logged on to our website. Those voting against the motion, please vote no in the comment section below or raise your hands. Ladies and gentlemen, our final closing debate, The Age of Iconoclasm. B. Rowlatt, Edward Chancellor, Nick Robbins, Swapan Dasgupta, William Dalrymple, and Zareen Masani, moderated by Mukulika Banerjee. Mukulika, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to host the finale of this extraordinary festival, during which over 3 days we've heard some wonderful, incisive, and moving conversations. JLF at the British Library is a summer highlight for many of us who live in London, and we are grateful that Teamwork Arts has continued to host it this year, despite the many challenges. This year, at the height of the pandemic, on 25th May, a tall, 6'6", 46-year-old man called George Floyd was asphyxiated to death by a police officer in Minneapolis in the US. This appalling event triggered widespread demonstrations across the US against the naked racism behind police brutality. They brought up the record of the slave trade and its legacy of racial injustice that has corroded American life ever since. The shockwaves crossed the Atlantic, and when they reached Britain, it led to protesters toppling Edward Colston's statue into the harbour in Bristol. A man hitherto glorified for his philanthropic work, but vilified now for his ill-gotten gains from slave trade. This event revived discussions of decolonization that have swept through university campuses across Britain in recent years and raised questions about the thousands of other statues that dominate city centers and parks across the country. The discussion was divided among those who argued that statues must be seen in the context in which they were erected, not the present one, and detractors who argued that Britain needed to face up to its legacy of colonialism and empire and teach it in history lessons in school, which it has shamefully failed to do so up until now. Some argued that statues should stay, but be accompanied by a plaque that provided a full account of the person's life, including details of their involvement in slave trade and colonial looting, while others felt that the story of colonialism is too complex to be nuanced in a plaque, and grand statues always necessarily glorify. The debate continued to rage, resulting in a recent petition that gathered over 85,000 signatures to remove the statue of Robert Clive from the Foreign Office, as it gave a man of dubious repute an exaltation he did not deserve. Each of our speakers today has taken a stand on this issue and have published articles that have been widely read and discussed. This debate will give us the pleasure of hearing them live and seeing which side of the debate wins the audience vote at the end. So please make sure you have voted now and vote again at the end. Sanjay, do we have the voting results yet?
Yes, Bukulika, it's a 60% yes and a 40% no.
Okay, that's close. That's a reasonably close vote. So 60% think that statues in Britain should be removed to a museum of colonialism, and 40% think that they should stay where they are, presumably. So we're going to see whether what our speakers have to say persuades the audience otherwise, and of course we'll report back to you what the final vote is. But now over to our speakers. First up is B. Rowland.
Thank you. I love words. I believe in the ability to convey meaning by the written word is our superpower as humans. But this debate goes beyond words. It's about symbols. Heinrich Zimmer wrote in Philosophies of India that symbols hold the mind to truth, but are not themselves the truth. Each civilization, every age, must bring forth its own. And that is exactly what's happening right now, thanks in large part to Black Lives Matter. And I know that Chopin's going to complain about wokeness and liberals, but the fact is the only reason we're having this debate is because of Black Lives Matter. Now, the question of whether to move some of Britain's more crusty old statues into a museum of colonialism has already been answered, as far as I'm concerned, with perfect elegance and subtlety by India. It's called Coronation Park. Delhi has some stunning parks. This is not one of them. It's a dusty, neglected, unloved space next to a motorway, and it's lined with George V, some of his viceroys, some Sir whoever's, and they're shuffled into awkward lines like so many usual suspects. They haven't been destroyed. They've just been put in their place for anyone that wants to go and have a look. The writer Roxane Gay recently wrote about monuments and of the importance of reminders of our failings as well as our successes. And Coronation Park is the very embodiment of this. This is why we know that it works. So I'm happy that we've settled this argument now. I think, though, that we can go even further. We should challenge the very idea of statues themselves. And I say this as someone who's been campaigning for years for a memorial to Mary Wollstonecraft, the Enlightenment philosopher, foremother of feminism and architect of human rights, whose legacy was destroyed and written out of history. We're a very small campaign, and finally we have funding, and the memorial is set to be unveiled very soon, Corona permitting. It's taken a really, really long time. And throughout those years of campaigning, fundraising, and railing against the multiplicities of statues of old military white men on horseback, I have shifted my position. It started 10 years ago as, look at all these men, there should be some women. Now, that's still true, but it's much more complicated than that. Most statues, even if they're of people you like, project power and an individual superiority, and they look down on us by definition. So the answer is a different kind of art, a responsive art, a living form of history. And the memorial to Mary Wollstonecraft by the iconic artist Maggie Hambling will be a sculpture that celebrates women's struggle and the birth of a movement. And it will feature Wollstonecraft's words, "I do not wish women to have power over men, but over themselves." In conclusion, public art does hold a responsibility. More statues, more context, and more statues that aren't statues at all. Look, I just need one there.
The rules are strict. Okay, so I think we've heard. I think you've made your points and they've come across. So sorry about being cut off. But up next is Edward Chancellor.
Has he heard you? Good. Thank you. Yeah, I can hear you. Let me start. I'm going to set, if you can hear me, some broader context. The current statue bashing is part of the woke movement with its cancel culture, denunciations, forced confessions, censorship, intolerance, and profound anti-intellectualism. It is an assault on the values of the Enlightenment and espouses a cultural nihilism. And behind this is a woke approach to history that is ill-informed, one-sided, and anachronistic. It can't understand or accept that different periods have different values and that the historian should strive to be impartial. It turns history into propaganda, a branch of grievance studies promoted by loudmouth activists and their opportunistic hangers-on in academia and elsewhere. Recent attacks on statues have been indiscriminate and ignorant. 14th century Scot Robert the Bruce was Gandhi is accused of being racist. Gladstone, Lincoln, Churchill, Robert Clive, all racist. Give an inch to these people and no statue will be left standing. Now, I think there's a failure to understand what a public statue signifies. To my mind, a public statue does not signify approval, but merely acceptance that the person commemorated was once recognized for some achievement, whatever that may have been. Karl Marx in Hampstead, outside of his house, without accepting approval of communism or condoning the deaths of hundreds of millions of people in the 20th century at the hands of communists. Even the Soviets let the wonderful statue of Peter the Great, the bronze horseman by Falconet in St. Petersburg, even though the Russian emperor was responsible for the deaths of 200,000 serfs building his city and murdered his son with his own hands. Statues are part of a nation's fabric along with its architecture and material arts. To tear down a statue is to rend this fabric. It is a revolutionary act, especially in a nation with a long and continuous history such as England. And it poisons the common. Forcing people to remove statues is an act of cultural imperialism. Iconoclasm has historically been associated with religious extremism, Cromwell, Aurangzeb, ISIS, totalitarianism, and imperialism. After their occupation of France, the Nazis enforced the wholesale removal of statues of people they conceived to be their enemies. So I would say that trying, attempting to, I won't continue.
Thank you, Edward. I think for our future speakers are now warned. It's no point competing against the drum roll, so it's probably best to stop as Edward did. Thank you very much. Next up, speaking for the motion is Nick Robbins.
Thank you very much, Mukulika. It's great to be with you all. I think when we focus on the legacy of empire, we really should be focusing on fundamentals, how our financial system is organized so it doesn't underwrite modern slavery, how our corporations are governed so they don't run amok like the East India Company, and how our legal systems operate to remove impunity for violations of human rights wherever they may take place. We also obviously need to deal with questions of public memory, how history is taught in schools, and how it's represented on our streets and statues and memorials. By and large, I'm not particularly obsessed with statues from the past. When I first published my book, The Corporation That Changed the World, in 2006, I finished the story outside the egregious statue of Robert Clive by the Foreign Office, for me a clear symbol that Britain had not confronted its imperial past. But I didn't focus particularly overly on whether it should be taken down. By the time the second edition had come out and really in discussion with many people, it was clear to me that Clive's statue should be removed to a museum. And little did I imagine that Black Lives Matter would make the issue of memorialization so central in 2020, prompting the campaign that Mukulika mentioned, which actually has now 88,000 people calling for Clive's statue to be removed, a campaign I support. So why do I think Clive's statue should be taken down? First, there are no saving graces. There's no offset. His battle of Plassey was won by corruption, and the consequences were disastrous for India and ultimately China through the opium trade. There's nothing to offset, nothing to praise. Second, I think it's very important to focus on when this statue was put up. It is a pure piece of imperial propaganda put up over 150 years after Plassey, after his death. It took that long to rehabilitate Clive. For his contemporaries, he was the most hated man in England. It would have been simply laughable for his contemporaries to put up a statue to Robert Clive. So I think 100 years on, we're quite within our rights, over a century later, to ask whether Clive is the best person to represent Britain outside our Foreign Office, and quickly conclude that he is not. The third reason I think that we should take down Clive is I think it's a fantastic opportunity for cultural renewal, identifying potentially a new hero to stand outside the Foreign Office, better representing our relationship with the outside world. So yes, I agree with the motion that it's time to remove Clive's statue and perhaps some others and put it in a museum where it can be properly contextualized.
Excellent. Thank you for your brilliant timekeeping, Nick. Well done. And speaking against the motion next is Swapan Dasgupta.
Swapan is muted.
Thank you. I come from a civilization that loves idols. We love statues. The bigger, the merrier. We commemorate some of them in a permanent sort of way in temples. There are others which we host idols for seasonally, and then we immerse them in water. And that's part of life as far as India is concerned. There is a degree of permanence and there is a degree of impermanence. So the idea that Edward Colston's statue in Bristol has been submerged, albeit temporarily, doesn't come as a great shock. It is part of life. But behind that comes another thought process. It's not merely a question of how you write history. Your history was never going to be written on the basis of how one statue in Bristol looked like. It was always going to be written on something else. And this is not an attempt to rewrite history or make history a little more even-handed. What it really amounts to is airbrushing history, throwing out a lot of uncomfortable things and believing in sanitizing the past to make it palpable to contemporary morality. Therefore, Clive must be judged by the standards of today. The East India Company must be judged by the norms of corporate governance which are established today. Napier, or for that matter, Havelock, whose statues grace Trafalgar Square, must not be seen as great warriors. Okay, you don't want to see them as great warriors, don't see them. Put something else in it. Put a greased cartridge there in one of the plinths of Trafalgar Square, if that's what your artistic imagination lends you to believe. This is the this is a certain travesty which is going on, because it's not something which everybody agrees with. It is not something which is taken from India alone. In India, we have the Coronation Park. We have removed a lot of statues of imperial greats from there. But do you realize one thing? Colonialism was a little more subtle and a bit more nuanced than that. We have kept intact all the Indians who actually sang paeans and spoke about the nobility of the British Empire. Their statues, whether of Dadabhai Nauroji, whether of Firoz Shah Mehta, whether of Sir Hariram Goenka in Calcutta, they are intact. They were made also by the colonial masters. So this sort of thing, should we also take them out? Should we also dump them? Should we also not recognize that Legacy was not won by Supreme alone? It was won because of an
Thank you, Swapan. So we come to the final two speakers. And next up is William Dalrymple speaking for the motion.
Well, like Swapan, I also love statues, and I certainly wouldn't want to see most of the nation's statues torn down, but we have to use discrimination. When we go to Germany, we do not expect to see Hitler or any of the Nazi war criminals or SS officers standing on plinths. And in the same way, we have to weed out the war criminals from our country. Characters like John Nicholson are people we have to remember. He proposed a bill, and I'm quoting here from his own words, a bill for the flaying alive, impalement or burning of the murderers of British women and children. He proposed torture for all of them, and he said, I would willingly inflict the most excruciating tortures I could with a perfectly easy conscience. And this was not just something that he talked about. He every time he was asked for trial records of people he had dealt with, he simply replied, the punishment for mutiny is death. His statue, there are two statues of his in Northern Ireland still standing. Sir Colin Campbell's statue stands on Clydeside, but he is someone who sewed sepoys into pigskins and made them lick up the blood in the BB Gar before blowing them from the mouths of cannon. Havelock did the same. And murdered between Campbell and Havelock around 100,000 non-combatants in Lucknow and Kanpur. These are things that we describe as war criminals anywhere else. So it's not a matter of being woke. It's not a matter of being fashionable or trendy, but it's being realistic about some of the really terrible things that happened in our past and teaching them to our children. And if we put them in the Museum of Colonialism, this is an opportunity to teach, because we can set up a museum which will do what at the moment the curriculum fails to do. At the moment, our children at schools go from Henry VIII to Wilberforce, and the impression they get is that the British Empire was always about liberating slaves, was always about anti-racism. The things the British did in India and elsewhere are simply not taught in the syllabus. And this is a problem. When the British go out into the world, they don't know what Indians know about the Raj. They don't know what the Irish know about the potato famine. They don't know what the Australians know. They don't know what the Australians know about the mass extinction of the Tasmanian Aborigines. So we need to teach this in our schools, and the opportunity of setting up a museum of colonialism with some of these war criminals and other statues seems to me an opportunity we must take.
Thank you, William. And so to our final speaker, Zarir Masani.
I'm opposing this motion because I think we need a far more nuanced approach that recognizes the complexity of people's reputations. Political fashions change. Every age has its own heroes and villains. Most of our statues are Victorian. Most Victorians were racist and sexist, as were most Indians, Chinese, Arabs, or Africans at that time. in the 19th century. Should we be pulling them all down? This includes people as diverse as Nelson and Gladstone, Churchill, even Mahatma Gandhi. Yes, there are demands to remove him, and of course the ubiquitous Rhodes. For me, it's important to judge people by the standards of their own times and not our own. It's absurd to prosecute people for what we call war crimes today, but what were completely normal and legal forms of war booty in the 19th century. I don't include the kind of massacres William has mentioned, but war booty of the kind that Clive took, and he didn't massacre anyone, were completely legal. No court of law would have prosecuted him today for it. Historical opinions differ, and it's important that those decisions about our public spaces, like the Clive statue in front of the Foreign Office, are made by the public democratically. We have a parliament elected to do it, not 88,000 people, but representing 65 million. So most of whom would want the Clive statue to stay. In Shrewsbury, they had public consultations, they've had rival petitions, it's been debated by the council, which decided democratically to keep its Clive statues. People wanted it. So I think not historians like us, the wider public should decide. There are a few exceptions, dictators like Saddam, Hitler, Stalin, but they were universally regarded as genocidal mass murderers by the standards of their own time, not just by ours. And people widely decided to pull them down. Finally, I want to say that the current wave of iconoclasm focuses on symbols of long past Western transatlantic slavery. What we are ignoring, and what the Black Lives Movement ignores, is widespread slavery today. No one is talking about it. And the Global Slavery Index, believe it or not, says the country that leads the world in slavery is Africa today, with over 9 million people enslaved. Not a word about it from the Black Lives Movement. Finally, I think we need to look at the ethics of pulling down statues of donors and keeping their donations. If it's blood money, we should be thinking of returning it either to their heirs or to the people they...
Thank you all very much. You've put forward your views and the audience has heard you. Questions have started coming in and we'll take them up very briefly. While people are sending their questions in and thinking about which way to vote, I thought I'd just take a few minutes to reflect on the themes that have emerged across your various testimonies and arguments, but also pose perhaps some specific questions to you, which you can respond to when you have your final 2 minutes in the debate. So clearly there are two big issues that come up here. Is the motion calling for can it be characterized as a typical woke move and therefore somehow diminished by it, because it is a politically correct knee-jerk reaction to a past that exists, that has existed, that is real, and should not be apologized for. If this is an issue about history, therefore, is woke history a history that one needs to support or actually characterize and woke and therefore dismiss? And what this knowledge about the past actually does to contemporary times. It's not just about what the Victorians did or what happened in the colonial period, but the repercussions that an image of a Great Britain does to contemporary debates about global Britain. And so clearly the impact these historical debates have on the present have to be accounted for. I mentioned the decolonization movement that has swept campuses across Britain. And one very important point that has come out of that movement, which some speakers here have shared, is that really it is about self-knowledge. It's about admitting and acknowledging, learning, and to learn, think critically about who makes history, who writes it, what are we consuming, are we aware of the different strands of race, class, caste, gender in those constructions of history, in those texts that we read uncritically sometimes. And in order to do this, in order to genuinely decolonize, and I say this as an anthropologist teaching undergraduate students every year in Britain, in order to be able to decolonize, you need to know. You need to know why there is a need to decolonize and how to decolonize. And this is the point that has been made today and has been made by a growing number of people, that really the way history is taught in British schools at the moment is simply not up to the task. Children routinely go through the schooling system in Britain without knowing about the empire, knowing about Britain's colonial past, warts and all. So good things, bad things, none of it is known. So it's a kind of dark hole. So there is no way to connect Britain's own past with the presence of people from other races in this country. So, B, if I can just start by asking you a slightly provocative question, and maybe this will allow you to finish saying what you were saying as well, are you saying, therefore, that statues are okay as long as they are not, as long as they are of women?
No.
And if so, where you began to tell us that you changed your mind, that got drummed out a bit. So you can come back to that just to tell us what kind of statues are okay and what kind aren't, and not now. I think you'll get your chance when each of you get your 2 minutes at the end. So that's yours. Edward, you talked about cancel culture. And, you know, as a student of history yourself, how history and historians deal with decolonization is something that I'd really like you to reflect on. What do you feel about the state of knowledge in British society about the empire? And do you really think that this is some sort of white person's guilt that is best avoided and let's move on? Or is there a need for further education?
Mukulika, you could ask the speakers to respond now, because their comment at the end is a separate thing. So you can take these questions, then go to the questions from the audience that's been streaming in, and then you can go to closing comments. So you can get each of them to respond to your question.
Lovely. So B, do you want to maybe we can take the first two speakers' responses and then move on.
Well, you asked me to determine which statues are okay and which statues aren't, and I just wouldn't presume to be the arbiter of that. That's not for me to decide. I just think that people should be able to engage and challenge the public art that's around them. I think that's absolutely critical. We shouldn't just accept the furniture that dots our cities and have it sort of glaring down upon us. I think it's not correct that Edward argued that statues are not a sign of approval. They are the ultimate sign of approval. You're literally putting a figure on a pedestal for everyone passing by to have to look up to. And so I actually find it, I mean, people are throwing around the term woke and decolonization as though it's an insult. I find it very exciting that people are scrutinizing history, people are engaging with history. Anybody that's involved with history should enjoy this moment as a really exciting time, that people are engaging with these historical figures in a quest to learn more. And that's what public art should serve.
Thank you. Edward, did you want to talk about history?
Yeah. Let me give you just my thoughts on history. So, Willie Dalrymple and I read history at the same college in Cambridge almost 3.5 decades ago. And in my day, I learned a lot of European history, but no colonial history. And in retrospect, I'm rather upset by that, because I got slightly bored of doing too much French history. Having said that, one of the things about being taught to be a historian is you learn to read history. So if you learn to read history, you can read it afterwards. And I'm slightly wary of reconfiguring the curriculum for a sort of, if you will, a sort of contemporary political propaganda purpose. Now, if one could change the curriculum to teach more imperial history, and I've taught myself a fair deal of Indian, Chinese, and Indian and Japanese history, which I wasn't taught at university. If you could do that without sort of, if you will, having a sort of political message to ram down through people's throats, then I would all be in favour of it. And what Willie said about this sort of, Tudor to Wilberforce, I thought it was Henry to Hitler. It's clear that our teaching of history at schools is very narrow, actually, and I don't approve of that at all.
Thank you very much. Nick, I think you were next, and I mean, you please feel free to respond to what has been said already about history. But also, you ended on the note saying Clive is not the best person to put outside the Foreign Office. Would you propose an alternative candidate?
Well, great question. Again, it's not. I don't think it's for me to decide. I mean, one of the things, maybe just to talk particularly about this, is that I think in Britain, certainly in London, there's a great invisibility about empire. And that's what's so striking when I started looking at the East India Company. You go to the city where the East India Company was based and Leadenhall Street, there's nothing at all. And so you suddenly get this statue of Robert Clive. So I think that's why it is such a shock. Again, I think Zaria's point is very, very strong, that actually this needs to be decided democratically. The point about democratic protests and petitions is to bring these concerns to representative agencies to make those decisions. In London, the mayor has decided to set up a well-balanced panel to go through these very, very complicated issues, and they will come to very many decisions. Many statues might stay. Some might go, some might be contextualized with panels or so on. As in the case of Robert Clive, there's a wonderful piece of artwork giving a shadow of all the things that were the consequences. And you could have that, which obviously foreign ambassadors and dignitaries could walk over as they go up into the foreign. So lots of solutions, but I think that these solutions need to be chosen democratically, and we could put it to the people. It's not for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. Shapun, you started by talking about Indian traditions and the worship of idols, a tradition I share too, but that's kind of partly the point, isn't it? That the monumentalism of public statues, or indeed the intimacy of one's God, they are by definition, by their very materiality, about celebration, about respect. So point taken that history doesn't depend on statues, but when you say contemporary morality cannot judge the past, would you put, say, the decolonization movement, or indeed calls for diversification of the history curriculum in British schools, as contemporary morality?
See, the more and more I hear this debate, I think this is not a universal problem. This is not a universal debate. This is a uniquely British problem, a British problem limited to its own curriculum and how history is taught. Now, the limitations of how the schools are teaching history in Britain should not be taken to imply that this is a definitive statement on how empire existed, how empire was run, votes and all. Now, the same anguish, the same sort of pangs of guilt, which has overwhelmed the large section of the population of the United Kingdom, does not exist in India, where there is a far more casual approach to empire as something which happened. There were a lot of bad things about it. There are a lot of things which we disparage about it, but we also recognize that it is that we are today what we are, partly, not totally, because of what the empire was all about. So there is, to my mind, a greater degree of self-confidence about how you deal with the empire. And therefore, you might remove Lord Curzon as being architect, a criminal, the person who sort of partitioned Bengal and triggered a series of events. At the same time, you do recognize Lord Curzon as the person who founded the Archaeological Survey. Just like the Tatars, you recognize them as one of the greater pioneer Indian industrialists. But there is no doubt that they too had a hand in the opium trade in China. Likewise, Clive has spoken about. You must recognize that Plassey was won by a series of duplicity, perfidy, and treachery. But the Hindu merchants of Calcutta celebrated the defeat of Siraj-ud-Dawla and the victory of Clive for very reasons. Now, these are certain odd bits of history. Now, if you're going to try and limit all of this to a series of denunciations, to a series of committees which are going to decide by a show of hands what's right and what's wrong, I think you are just, it's to my mind, it's a travesty. Yes, there may be cases where you might feel that Clive outside St. James's Park or in front of the FCO is no longer appropriate. That's all right, fair enough. But are you going to make this an escalating, a snowballing movement whereby the antecedents of every person, Gladstone's father or grandfather was something else? In that case, I wonder with your husband's pedigree, whether you should be allowed into India. You know, Rowlatt was a infamous name in England, but I don't think anybody really would say that you don't have a right to be welcomed in India today as you were. So I think let's not get into history as a series of transient slogans whereby someone says Churchill is a racist 5 times and that gets cleaned over, and the cenotaph is attacked. That's, to my mind, not history. That's not good taste, and I think it's awful politics.
Thank you very much. Willie, I think what Edward, your old friend, has said, I mean, your book, The Anarchy, would be classified under political propaganda. Are you willing to accept that?
No, I wouldn't. I think it's a very balanced account. And the fact that it's been a bestseller in both Britain and in India implies that both sides have seen things in it. I think, in fact, that there's not a huge gulf between the two sides here. Zaria accepted that mass murderers should not be on pedestals, and I would be very happy if it was only the mass murderers who were removed. In other words, people like Havelock Nicholson and Colin Campbell, who can actually make a very strong case, would be people that would be put in the equivalent of Nuremberg trial if they were around today. People that killed innocent people in huge numbers and were responsible for mass murder. And it is that sort of distinction, so not a broad brush, all the colonialists must go, of course not. There are figures like William Jones and so on who we could hugely admire and should be teaching in our schools. But the mass murderers have to be paired off. The British seem to be very good at accepting colonialism is terrible when other Europeans do it. If it's Belgians in the Congo or the Germans in Namibia, the British are very happy to accept this is a deeply sensitive thing. But suddenly, as soon as you get the magic word Raj into it, suddenly it's all about elephants and croquet and Simla and lovely ladies in parasols floating around. But it matters. I think it matters terribly that people do romanticize it in that matter. Because as we saw after Brexit, the first thing the British did after Brexit was to send a delegation of businessmen to Modi, expecting that they were going to be welcomed, and they literally called it Empire 2.0. Go back to the Empire. They love us. It'll be fine. And it wasn't. It wasn't fine at all. They went with a bloody nose. They weren't prepared to give me visas, and the whole diplomatic mission collapsed in a terrible humiliation for Theresa May. So that's a concrete example of how misunderstanding our place in the world and how other people see us through romanticism and a failure to live up to accept the sins of the past, actually queer our foreign policy on a daily basis. That's why I think it matters. We have to be able to go out to the world as the Germans have done, face up to the past, apologize for the things that need apologizing for, and then move on.
Thank you. Zari, finally, let me put to you a question that has come in from one of our audience members, who says, isn't it, Yasser Alvi this is, isn't it interesting that the only 2 non-white participants in the panel are both speaking against the motion? Is this instructive how this brouhaha is simply a manifestation of white guilt?
Well, I think it is partly, but you know, I think we could sort of, I wouldn't generalize from the fact that we happen to be black and the people for the motion happen to be white. But I think there is a sense in which I don't think this debate should be decided by people like William and myself and Bea and Edward, however distinguished we are in our different fields, because their public spaces belong to the public and not to the Mayor of London. Parliament should decide London is the capital of a nation. Its public spaces and monuments belong to the whole nation. So if you're moving a statue from outside the Foreign Office, whether it's Clive or anyone else, the British public via Parliament must decide. That's what Parliament's for. Secondly, as far as reputations go, I do want to emphasize one can disagree diametrically. You know, William and I both disagree diametrically about Clive, how much he achieved, whether he was basically a decent person or not. You know, I regard him as a highly talented, bipolar, someone who suffered from manic depression, achieved a huge amount from very modest origins, was hated by the aristocracy for coming from those humble origins and actually challenging them. So I think there is a whole alternative interpretation. I think cancelling people by taking down their statues or putting them in museums where no one will see them is not the answer. I think there should be a broad public democratic debate, not by historians.
Thank you very much. And I suppose the riposte to that would be, in order to have a public debate on anything, you need a certain basic level of awareness and the information in that public, which, as people arguing for the motion would say, is woefully missing at the moment. So what would you debate on the basis of? Now, there is a question here from Avik, who says, considering BLM, Black Lives Matter, was brought up a few times, isn't it much more imperative to focus on policy and economic reform rather than on symbolism? Police reform, prison reform, developing inner cities come to mind. Doesn't talking about statues make this a culture war rather than a substantial policy debate? Would somebody like to take that? Nick, do you want to?
Yeah, as I started, I think we need to focus on the fundamentals, and I think if we're looking outwardly, I think we need to look at our sort of current financial, corporate, and political behaviour. So I would have a lot of sympathies with that, and my view is that we need to be very, very selective in how we take this forward. I think it was interesting in London how the statue of Robert Milligan, a slave trader, was taken away very, very quietly outside the museum in Docklands. I don't think this should be our main focus. I think our main focus should be on good history promoted broadly, and on thinking more fundamentally about current practices, which may be dealing with issues of slavery, as here dealt with, or indeed human rights abuses, and be mindful of our past and how we focus on those issues, and indeed existing inequalities, racial and other inequalities in our own society, is the question I mentioned.
Thank you very much. Make the point again about the fact that Black Lives Matters is not addressing slavery today. We don't hear them demonstrating about Uyghurs in China. We don't hear them demonstrating about Black lives in Africa. So I think a present-day racism in Britain is not being addressed. These are symbols of historic racism and slavery, which are not dealing with the present.
Bea, would you like to respond to that?
Yes. I mean, it's not really for me to respond. I'm not black, but are you putting a burden of all the problems of the world onto one movement?
No. I mean, if Black Lives Matter...
Whataboutery, and anyone that's done any kind of campaign will find it immensely tiresome when people come up to them and go, oh, but what about this thing and that thing? Why aren't you campaigning about the Uyghurs? I think for black people, and I don't want to speak for black people, obviously, but I think the idea is just to stop being shot by police would be great. And, you know, maybe you can campaign for the Uyghurs, or I could. I mean, it's just putting everything onto Black Lives Matter. That's just ridiculous.
I think what the Black Lives Matter campaign has done is also provided a critique of capitalism, or at least point out that the story of capitalism is one that relies on colonial extraction, slavery, a circulation of people and money that has simply remained quite opaque. So it isn't about everything. I don't think the BLM movement would say that, but it is a very specific critique around issues of race that needs to be focused and had. Okay, so here's an interesting one, and any of you can take this up. Sorry.
Black Lives Matter shouldn't be doing that. We've almost hijacked their debate to talk about statues. I mean, we're not black people, and here we are having a conversation about what Black Lives Matter should and shouldn't do. I just don't. I don't think that's a core part of what this debate is. The reason we're talking about the statues is because of the Black Lives Matter movement, but this isn't a forum to say they should be doing this or that.
We're talking about tokenism.
Sorry, let me just take a few more questions. Michael O'Callaghan asks, if some ancient Greeks had come to Britain in 400 BC and left a statue of Plato, should we now pull it down? Greek society was involved in slavery. William?
No, I mean, I don't think you should be making parallels with other things. We have a specific problem here, that in Britain, the empire is not taught. We are not educated on the good or the bad things that the empire did. And that is reflected in the fact that statues of mass murderers continue to litter this country. I think it is a problem for us today because the people who walk our streets do not know this history, but the rest of the world does. So I think we have a very specific problem. I don't see it as part of Black Lives Matter. I don't see it even as a matter of guilt. I see it as a matter of national importance, that our people understand the good and the bad of the past. That's what teaching history is all about. And historians, I mean, I agree with Zaria that in the end, the decision has to be down to our politicians, but it is the job of us historians to educate, to write, to debate as we're doing now. So I think it's not enough to say that leave it to the politicians. One thing I have to say, I do envy Zaria is his miniatures behind him. And every time he comes on the screen, I want to see all the beautiful pictures that he has behind him. That's for a debate for another day.
Mukalika, can I say one thing in response?
Very quickly.
I hate this trope about whataboutery. It's a typical left-wing trope for dismissing what I would call historical context. We actually have to see things in context, and we have to decide where we focus our energies and our resources as a society.
Thank you for that. Vijay Rao asks, multiple members of the panel have acknowledged the fact that fashions and ideas regarding historical figures change over time. If political and social fashions change, why can't street decoration? Edward, would you like to take that?
Yes, I don't see why they shouldn't. Street decorations shouldn't change over time. We're just, it's a complicated matter. I mean, by all means, remove statues from time to time if there's almost no interest in them. I can see that. What we're trying to talk about, debate now, is whether the tearing down of statues is a sort of fair historical and contains a fair historical analysis of what of the character who's being torn down or denounced, and the reason it was put up in the first place. I don't actually agree with B that one's forced to look up at statues. I spent most of my life sort of wandering around at the pedestals of statues, never once looking up to see who was there. So I don't think one's forced to do that. And I agree that at a sort of local democratic level, or even at a higher democratic level, or even at an institutional level, such as Oriel College, Oxford, deciding what to do about its Cecil Rhodes statue, that these things can be debated. My problem, and it goes back to my earlier position, is that inverted commas woke history is very shallow, is very ill-informed. And I go back to Clive of India. I don't think that Willie Dalrymple's characterization of Clive in his book is fair. What we know about Clive is that he wasn't an imperial aggressor. He was a person, if you will, sort of plucked from a clerical writing desk and found himself by accident playing a part in history. And I think that is, in a way, the Clive statue came there at a much later date, but Clive is an accident of history, and I think one can accept that. If people wish democratically to remove it and have an informed debate, as we're perhaps having today, then that's fine by me.
I mean, that's an interesting observation. I'm trying to stay neutral and not say that's an interesting concession, Edward, but in a sense, debating theatrics aside, I think what is emerging is that fine, as long as we have a well-informed discussion about this, good. And what people who do talk about taking down statues, and of course the motion, we must remind everyone, restates also that there should be a museum of colonialism. So there is some commitment to education and knowledge and teaching and dissemination of this. Then the two things, so it's really about both those things. It's not just about tearing down, it's also building up a certain knowledge base about the empire. And in that kind of scenario, what we can say is that if frankly this hadn't happened, if Colston's statue hadn't been pulled down, we wouldn't be using this motion for the closing debate of the JLF. So at least it's provoked a very interesting discussion. There are lots of questions coming in. I think what I'll do very quickly is just read out a couple of the slightly longer ones, and then we'll move straight into your closing remarks, where each of you have a couple of minutes to wrap up. So, Kamini Dandapani asks, do you think there is a need for statues at all, the ones on pedestals especially? Should we just stop this practice going forward? Edward Mortimer asks, does it have to be either or? I do find all these colonial and military statues around Whitehall and Waterloo Place, etc., rather oppressive, but I'm not sure I'd want to go and see them all in a museum either. How many people actually visit Coronation Park in Delhi that Swapan talked about? B did. Couldn't we have a selective cull and use the remaining statues more imaginatively to explore the actual history of the empire, colonized as well as colonizers? Dave Balewell asks, William, will there be a bias when teaching about British colonialism in the UK? For example, India might demonize British colonists. I'm not entirely sure who would demonize whom in Britain, but I'll let you interpret that. Maureen asks, statues are about power. If you want to keep them there, how do you balance their influence? So I think I've done fair justice to the many questions that have come in, and we'll follow the order as before and start with B. And your 2 minutes starts now. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I think some people, I think, are probably worried by this, the terms of this debate, and in addressing contested heritage, that we lose something, that something will be taken away. And that's not actually the case. What it is adding to history. That's why I love this. This is what keeps history alive and not kind of gathering dust. History is a conversation. It isn't frozen. It's ongoing. Now, I had a funny feeling that Swapan might mention my name. Thank you for that, Swapan. And I'm really glad you did. For those of you who don't know, yes, my husband is Justin Rowlatt, and he's a direct ancestor of the creator of that piece of legal atrocity, the Rowlatt Act. We, as a family in India, went to Jallianwala Bagh and learnt about it and engaged with that. confronted our own family history, and of course, apologized. I mean, Justin is on record apologizing for that. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. And that's why I'm glad you brought that up, because it's about not just leaving history as history, this kind of old era of, well, it was right then. It's about responding to it, returning to it, scrutinizing it close up. So what I want, and it's, again, I agree with Zarir on some of your points, but it's not about tearing statues down. It's about what we adding context. And what I want is for people to question the public art around them. I want them to challenge it and engage with it. Public art is political, and by its very nature, it does deal with power. This is no wonder then, of course, that some of the world's great strongmen are in love with great big statues. And we know that Narendra Modi has raised the world's biggest statue in the world of Sardar Patel. I mean, Vladimir Putin is busy popping Stalin back up onto plinths. And it's odd, it's sort of old fashioned, and it's almost as if they're compensating for something.
That's it. Edward, over to you. Have we lost Edward? Is he still here?
We may have lost him.
I think we've lost Edward. Come back to Edward Mukalika. You can move.
Yeah, sure. Let's move to Nick Robbins. Nick, over to you for your concluding 2 minutes.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, I think my sense still, it is, as we've discussed, this is a very British-focused debate, and I think Britain continues to blind itself by not properly engaging with its history and its imperial history. Clearly, we need to do that in the classroom and in university. Most people, however, are not in the classroom, and most people are not in the university. And so we need to have this broad public debate. I do like the idea of a selective cull, particularly if we can swap that with killing the badgers. I think we should relieve the badgers and maybe focus on some of the brutalists in British history. That would be a great swap in my view. And I think we do need to take this very, very seriously, particularly where we're talking about imposing the ethics of today on the past. I think that is not the right approach. So therefore, that again, I focus on Clive, but again, his contemporaries would have found it absolutely absurd that he is celebrated outside in such a way. And so I think a selective cull, brutalists, not badgers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Swapan, you're on next.
Yeah, only a few points I'd like to make. Number one, that there is this disgusting term which is called cultural appropriation, which is now doing the rounds. And by that logic, I don't think I'm in any state I'm in any position to actually talk about what's going on in the United Kingdom and in the wide society. However, since it's a debate which is about empire, it's about decolonization, I can only say that this is not a debate which really affects the erstwhile colonies too much. It's really a problem of the metropolitan center. Number two, an issue of which Willie spoke about as to why his book on the East India Company sold so well in both India as well as in the United Kingdom. I think it's a compliment to you as a good narrative historian. I think one of the biggest problems we face is that the decolonizers are the biggest bores. They put off people from history. If there is anything, if you hand over history to those people who are shouting the loudest now about these things, then I think you are going to ensure that entire generations in future are going to be deterred and put off completely by this whole thing. That's an important point to take. Thirdly, and I think this is a point, when you're talking about selective culling. Now, I take the point, but history is really about selective culling in any way. And you don't have to really set up a museum of colonialism. You can set it up. I mean, there are enough, if you've got enough public funds, you can set it up. But do consider one thing, that if museums are what you're talking about, do also consider that why have you been silent about what the artifacts in your existing museums, where they originate from, and should they remain there, and should the treasures of India be returned to India, or should they be there? I detect a strange, eerie silence as do I detect a strange slide.
Thank you. Willie, before you speak, can I request you especially to, since you wrote The Anarchy and you live in India and engage with debates in India, if you could also respond to Swapan's point that this is a peculiarly white man's problem, that this is not an issue in a place like India, where of course buildings, mosques have been pulled down, others have been raised. So it'll be great if you get that comparative angle in. Thanks.
Well, I think that in a sense Coronation Park has done the work. I'd agree with Swapan that it's a problem that has to be addressed in Britain rather than one in India. In India, in a sense, you have it. If you go to the Mutiny Memorial in Delhi, you see a plaque there saying the men described here as mutineers were independent fighters for a free India. And so what we're proposing has already happened there. And I would agree with Zarir and Edward that Clive was an utterly remarkable man. I had a huge pleasure writing about it, but I don't think he was someone we would want to emulate. I think he is in many ways a villain, but a remarkable one, a highly talented one. And a lot of the debate has been about tearing down, but the motion talks about erecting a museum. And I think it's very, very important this, because we are not being taught this in our schools. This is an opportunity, and I would recommend anyone who's listening to this debate to go to Washington, D.C. and see the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which is an astonishing museum, one of the great history museums of the world, done at huge cost and lavish sort of technical skills, amazing exhibits. But it does that impossible task of creating a narrative about slavery that is moving, palatable, balanced. And I was first told about it by a right-wing Tory friend of mine, who was not at all the sort of woke figure that we've been hearing denounced by the opposition. And he said he went there and with his family, and they were all in tears. And they came out educated and transformed by what they'd seen. There was so much they just didn't know. And I think if you did this museum right and used these statues creatively and told the story of colonialism, which has not been told, it could be an extraordinary and transformative thing. So I see it as an opportunity, not a problem.
I'm amazed that Ozymandias has not popped up in this. You know, this isn't a new debate. Shelley was on the money when he said, "Look upon my works, you mighty in despair." And, you know, history is not always kind to the strong man.
Thank you. Okay, Zarir, the floor is yours for 2 minutes.
Yes, we also have Edward back, I see. So, but I'll go first if you want me to, that's fine. I just want to reiterate that I think context is everything when you're looking at people's reputations. So judging them by today's context and today's values gets you nowhere. It's not a particularly useful way of looking at history. And, you know, I think that this discussion, useful as it has been, and I've enjoyed it, will be seen by the vast majority of the British public as hugely elitist and not you know, something they relate to at all, because all the polls, all the opinion polls show that about 90% of the British public do not want statues of the past changed for whatever reason. So I think you have to deal with the fact that we are a democracy. People have a say and have a right to determine what occupies their public spaces. And if they want Clive, Clive they shall have. And I will stand up and defend him as someone who had bipolar disorder, should have a lot of sympathy from today's concerns with mental health, committed suicide, because he was in such pain mentally and physically at the age of 49 and had achieved a huge amount, had won Britain an empire by then. So I think there are lots of reasons to discuss people like that. And I think if their statues were not there, we wouldn't have those discussions. So they should stay where they are so that we can have those democratic discussions.
Thank you very much. Edward, we missed you earlier. Would you like to take up your 2 minutes allocated time now? And you need to unmute yourself.
Is he hearing you?
Is Edward there?
Don't.
Yes, Edward, you need to unmute yourself, Edward. He may have well frozen again, Mukulika, if you want to do closing remarks, and then we can come back to him if he logs back on.
Okay, we'll watch the space closely. In any case, it might have skewed the audience poll a little bit to have two people speaking on the same side of the motion end this discussion. But I think everyone watching will agree that this has been rich and interesting. It's a debate that needs to be had, not just at JLF London, but across up and down the country. And I think Zarir's point is one that no one will disagree with, that people have a democratic right to choose these things. But as indeed events in Britain in the last few years have shown, not least at the referendum, that asking people for their vote on matters that they don't completely understand and know about can be a fairly hazardous thing as well. So information first, building up knowledge, educating the public. And indeed, you mentioned class, Zarir. I think part of what decolonizing does is actually introduce the issue of race, yes, but also class, because the working class of Britain was not a beneficiary of the empire in the same way that those who have written the narrative about empire. So it does open up those conversations in those intersections between race and class and gender and other things. So I'm going to hand things over to Sanjoy. Thank you to the audience for watching and I hope voting. Sanjoy is going to announce the results, but thank you to all my panelists for being excellent timekeepers. Thank you.
The best defense of a restrictive franchise I've heard for a long time.
Thank you so much, B. Edward Chancellor, Mukulika Banerjee, Nick Robbins, Swapan Das Gupta, William Dalrymple, and Zarir Masani. I would now like to poll our audience. So those for the motion, please vote yes online by typing it into the comment section or raising your hands if you are logged onto our site. So once again, those for the motions, please vote yes online by typing it into the comment section or raising your hand if you are on Zoom and logged onto our site. And those voting against the motion, please write no in the comment section below or raise your hands. So those voting against the motion, please vote no or raise your hands. And just to remind you all, this House believes the time has now come to remove the statues of former imperial heroes who would now be seen as war criminals to a museum of colonialism. Those voting yes for the motion, please write it into the comment section, and those voting no or against the motion, do put it into the comment section. While we wait for the results, let me thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for participating and supporting the festival. Please do continue to view and engage with our weekly JLF's Brave New World, which happens every Wednesday, Fridays and Saturdays. And of course, our new series, JLF Words Are Bridges, which is about translations across languages. And watch for our other JLF international editions, including JLF USA and Canada. We thank our partners, the Aga Khan Foundation, UK, and our patrons, the Murthy Family Foundation, for their support. And of course, the High Commission of India in the UK and the Nehru Center. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank my colleagues at Teamwork Arts for staying the course despite the hardships across and having to work from home and different locations all the time. And a very big thank you to Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple for putting together this fabulous program. And of course, our colleagues from the British Library. They've been always amazing. Thank you, B. Thank you, Rolly, John, and everybody. Thank you to our tech partners, Web Context. They've been amazing and they've stood by us for God knows how many years from their offices in Gurgaon and Jaipur. Thank you for making this happen. And to all our wonderful speakers and our audiences from across the world who've joined us every day. And I do hope once again, please, please, please do hope you'll consider donating to help us bridge the financial gap for JLF London at the British Library, which is of course free to view, and you can watch them on JLF Litfest on Facebook or Jaipur Litfest JLF on YouTube. You may also support the British Library by donating support.bl.uk/donate. And before I hand over to Jamie, let me just check if the results have come in. So the results is, for the motion, we have 53.33% votes, and against the motion, it's 46.66% votes. So you all did try and move the needle. However, the motion has been passed. Thank you all very much. Have a wonderful week. Stay safe, stay well. And thank you once again to our speakers.
Hello, I'm Jamie Andrews. I'm Head of Culture and Learning at the British Library, and it's been great having you with us for the past few days at JLF London at the British Library. It's been a carnival of conversation and debate and ideas, truly showing that JLF, Jaipur Literature Festival, is the greatest literary show on earth. You can see I'm standing here at the British Library. We are reopening our spaces, our galleries, our reading rooms, our public spaces, but for obvious reasons we have gone digital this year for JLF London. And that hasn't been easy, and I would just like to thank colleagues of mine at the British Library, not least John and Bea and the cultural events team. And also just to say from all of us at the library, huge thanks and congratulations to Namita and William for pulling the programme together, to Sanjoy and his amazing team at Teamworks. We've missed you this year. We can't wait to see you again in person, but we've been really pleased to work with you to make the spirit of JLF live online. Finally, I'd just say that you'll have enjoyed a whole series of events over the last few days, free access to them. That's a wonderful thing, but if you do feel able to support us, there is a donate button on the screen, and I would encourage you, if you feel able, to click on that button and help support the work we do. That's it. JLF 2020 at the British Library is over, but we hope to see you soon, either in Jaipur or back here at the British Library.
Teamwork Arts takes India's artistic diversity to the world across continents, traversing from Australia, Canada, China, Egypt, Germany, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Africa, Russia, South Korea, Sweden, UK and the USA in its stunning array of 16 international festivals in over 40 cities. A feast for the senses, these are spectacles of dance, music, cinema, theatre, literature and so much more. Teamwork Arts, celebrating the arts. For more information, visit teamworkarts.com or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.